Good morning. Very happy to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for the very nice invitation to this meeting. I'd like to start first by saying that it was a bit difficult for me in advance to estimate the nature of my audience, because some of you may be very familiar with the study of esotericism and the study of religion, while others come from a philosophy background and do not necessarily know much about this. So therefore I had to find a way to serve both this type of my audience, this part of my audience. So the first part of the lecture may contain some information that is very well known to some of you and might be entirely unknown to others. And then in the second part, I'm moving more into the philosophical part of my talk. So if at the beginning you feel that, oh, I know all of this, please just hang in there and eventually I will get to the exciting stuff, I hope. So, all right. In 1995, I published my first serious methodological article about the study of esotericism in the journal Method and Theory in the Study of Religion. And as you can see here, its title was Empirical Method in the Study of Esotericism. So there's the term empiricism. At the moment of publication, an intense battle about basic theoretical and methodological questions was raging in the study of religion, especially in the United States, around the contested legacy of the Romanian scholar Mircea Eliade. He had died just 9 years earlier. Having been forced from Romania, Eliade had settled in Chicago in the mid-1950s and became professor in the history of religions at the university there. He achieved great fame during the 1960s because of his many best-selling books focused on myth and symbolism that somehow appeared precisely to hit the soft spot of the zeitgeist. He became essentially the founder of history. Oh, goes a bit too early. He became the founder of the history of religions as a new academic discipline in the United States. Now, already before Eliade's death, there had been rumors about his youthful involvement in the Romanian movement known as the Legion of the Archangel Michael, better known as the Iron Guards, a violent Christian fascist movement known for its virulent anti-Semitic rhetoric. After Eliade's death, it quickly became evident that these stories had a solid basis. And this discovery led to a strong academic backlash against Eliade and against his entire approach. Critics were arguing that not just that the young Eliade had made a regrettable lapse of judgment, but they went much further than that. Too far, in my personal opinion, to suggest that fascist assumptions were somehow encoded in Eliade's methodology. Now, this argument caused nothing less than an identity crisis among a whole generation of American scholars of religion who had been raised with the assumptions and approaches of Eliade and of several other European scholars who had achieved similar levels of fame in the more or less in the same period. Notably, of course, the famous Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Now today, in the wake of important books that were published since the later 1990s by Stephen Wasserstrom and Hans Thomas Hackel, it has become evident that these approaches came from a specific European intellectual tradition that had its center in the famous annual meetings organized at the Lake of Ascona in Switzerland since 1933 and known as Eranos. During the mid-1990s, when I published that article of mine, the method and background assumptions associated with Eliade and other Eranos-related scholars were under attack from academics with a background in the social sciences. The result was a polemical process of polarization between what was often referred to at that time as religionism and reductionism. Religionists such as Eliade or Jung were criticized for their insistence that religion was a phenomenon sui generis, ultimately grounded in some kind of suprahistorical, archetypal or metaphysical reality beyond rational analysis. Their reductionist opponents argued that there should be no room in science and scholarship for such meta-empirical, read theological beliefs about true religion. They insisted that religious practices and beliefs could and should be strictly reduced to social dynamics, like all other forms of human culture throughout history. Now, eventually, though, it became clear that academic anti-religionism was based not just on the rationalist and secularist position of methodological agnosticism, of methodological atheism, not just based on the rational and secularist position of methodological atheism, the axiomatic assumption of that gods or any other meta-empirical entities or realities do not exist. The position rested also on political background assumptions congenial to academic Marxism and a range of associated critical theories. Scholars of such a persuasion found it hard to think of religion otherwise than as aligned to old-fashioned conservative or reactionary politics as they saw it, the traditional enemies of political and social progress based on rationalization and secularization. Therefore, it hardly came as a big surprise to them that religionist scholars like Eliade were in fact now being exposed as crypto-fascists. On the contrary, they found it important that academics would keep searching for similar anti-progressive agendas that might be lurking in the study of religion by seeking to expose or unmask, nowadays one might say call out, other scholars aligned to the Eranos meetings as possibly belonging to the same camp. Now, as a young scholar, born and raised in Europe, and here you see me with some of my friends and colleagues at that time, Antoine Fèvre sitting on the right, I was deeply fascinated, but also puzzled by this religionism versus reductionism debate. To be honest, the political background agendas were not yet very clear to me at that time, for reasons that have to do probably with my own Dutch and European backgrounds. Contrary to academic cultures, for instance, in France or Germany and the United States, Marxism had never played a role of any importance in Dutch politics and academia. The critical theories associated with post-structuralism and deconstruction played a very minor role in my own training at the University of Utrecht during the 1980s. As for the more hard-headed reductionist perspectives associated with the social and even the natural sciences, these were not particularly prominent either. The study of religion that I encountered as a student in the Netherlands at that time was usually neither religionist nor post-structuralist or reductionist in orientation, but in a country with a strong Calvinist tradition, a study of religion, as I encountered it, strongly situated itself against its chief competitor, which was Christian theology. Most importantly, study of religion, as I understood it, was focused on the historical and empirical study of primary sources, often aligned with textual criticism and an hermeneutics associated largely with Hans-Georg Gadamer. So as such, study of religion, as I was trained in it, required linguistic expertise and philological training in a variety of languages other than English. During my own years as a university student, Eliade's approach was something far away, not particularly relevant to what we saw as the real business, that of studying religious texts and traditions firsthand. A strong memory I have from the 1990s might illustrate this. I had made the acquaintance of Robert Siegel, you already saw his face earlier, who was himself a typical example of a Jungian who had changed his mind during the time of the Eliade scandal and had become one of the central defenders of the reductionist alternative. He came to the Netherlands, and I arranged a lecture for a large group of Dutch scholars of religion. Robert talked for an hour about the religionism and the Eliade debate, and it fell completely flat. There were no questions from the audience. He'd been talking very excitedly for an hour, and then after that there was dead silence. To Robert's considerable puzzlement, of course, and disappointment. Few people seemed to be aware even of the debate or showed any interest. It was clear that we were living on entirely different academic planets. Scholars of religion in the Netherlands were studying historical sources, critically, historically, while steering away from theological dogmatism. Eliade was of no importance to them. So much for the historical situatedness of the field as I got introduced to it. Now, in that article of mine, Empirical Method in 1995, I made some rather simple points. I objected to the black and white polarization of the Eliade debate, which assumed that you were either a convinced atheist reductionist who had to deny the existence of any presumed meta-empirical realities, such as gods or angels or spirits, or otherwise, in Siegel's words, as you can see here, you had to be necessarily a believer in illusory stuff that had no true reality, a kind of crypto-theologian masquerading as a scholar, either or, one or the other. There was no alternative. Well, I did not agree. I did not agree. Taking my cue from the Dutch scholar of religion, Jan Platvoet, whom you see here, I argued that this polarization made no sense of what most scholars were actually doing. For myself and countless colleagues, our work consisted, indeed, in careful empirical research focused on primary sources written by people who were, of course, expressing their particular beliefs in meta-empirical realities such as gods or angels. This kind of research did not require us as scholars to express any opinion, either way, about the reality or the non-reality of such entities. In fact, I agreed with Platvoet. Scholars simply had no methods for settling that kind of issues. We have no way of testing whether gods do or do not exist. And so we must leave that question open. In other words, an empirical historical perspective had to be grounded, I argued, in methodological agnosticism. As such, empiricism was nicely situated as a third perspective in between religionism and reductionism. Well, I cannot say that my article had any discernible impact on the debates among American scholars. I was just a beginner in the field. I was just starting up, and they were far too deeply entrenched in their own pro or anti-Eliadean polemics and in a theoretical debate that depended on how one positioned oneself ideologically with respect to crypto-Marxist assumptions and their close alignment with critical theories. It so happened, however, that my article did become one of the most frequently quoted references as my colleagues and myself began building up the study of esotericism after the mid-1990s. With we, I mean French scholars such as Antoine Fèvre and Jean-Pierre Braque, you see them here on this nice photo from the time, Dutch ones such as Roelof van den Broek, who is not in the photo, and myself, or Italians such as Marco Pasi, but also others from countries such as England and Austria, as you can see here. With hindsight, I see much more clearly than I did at that time how strongly our understanding of esotericism had always been based on theoretical and methodological premises that were at home in European scholarship and often quite alien to its American counterparts. In the United States, studying esotericism basically meant that you were aligned with some kind of esoteric religionism, or even a kind of perennialism, as illustrated by the dominant voices of that time. I remember, for instance, the utter puzzlement of American colleagues that I met at the pioneering sessions of esotericism organized by Antoine Fèvre and myself at the large conference of the IAHR in Mexico City in 1995. This was more or less the first large academic session on esotericism in the study of religion, 1995. For the American scholars present there, the empiricism and the methodological agnosticism of their European colleagues seemed to be coming from a different planet. They were totally mystified by it. They didn't know what to make of it. Now, all of this may help explain why the academic study of esotericism did become a success, mainly on this side of the Atlantic, as shown most clearly by the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism, created in 2005. Its American counterpart, the Association for the Study of Esotericism, created by the religionist, more or less perennialist scholar Arthur Versluis, was always marked by very different perspectives. Unfortunately, it did not apparently survive the pandemic of 2020. It seems to be defunct now. But there were these two approaches, the Association for the Study of Esotericism, led by Arthur Versluis, and then the ESWI in Europe. And these really came from very different backgrounds and mentalities and approaches. Now, I've begun this lecture with a short sketch of the backgrounds from which the study of esotericism emerged in the 1990s. And I did so in order to make 2 points. The first is that if I am arguing today for a radical empiricism and a radical agnosticism in the study of esotericism, this does not mean that I have become radicalized in the meantime. I see it rather as a very natural further and sharper formulation of basic positions that have always been integral to all my work since the 1990s, and to a large extent have become central to the study of esotericism as well, at least in Europe, since the 1990s. My second reason to begin in the way I did, with a lot of references to historical backgrounds and even to personal memories, is that such an overview precisely demonstrates a point that is in fact essential to what empiricism is all about, at least in my opinion. This is that the theoretical debates and their philosophical underpinnings never occur in a vacuum or in a space of abstract theorizing, and should not be studied as if they did, because theories and philosophies are themselves, in my view, historical phenomena. For an empirical historical scholar like myself, for instance, Eliade can only be understood adequately by thoroughly historicizing and contextualizing him in great detail as a Romanian scholar who started writing in his own language, in his own context, who came to the United States, became exposed to a new kind of culture there, and whose theoretical perspectives are deeply embedded in his personal biography. To quote a nice expression by Hans Thomas Hackel, that is hard to translate exactly into English, Wissenschaft becomes Menschenschaft. The craft of gaining knowledge in the humanities consists essentially of studying human beings. The Marxism-inflected critical theories of Eliade's opponents are no exception. I argue that just like Eliade and other religionists, they too should be thoroughly historicized, as the deeply personal, contingent, situated products of specific individuals, from Marx to Adorno and so on, whose ideas just happen to be the reflection of a different set of social and political developments that happens to have an impact on them. And of course, the same argument applies to my personal empirical historical perspective too. I'm certainly advocating my perspective as better than its religionist and reductionist competitors. Otherwise, if I didn't believe in it, why would I bother? But I'm perfectly aware that my approach comes from my personal experiences as a Dutch scholar who grew up in places like these, who happened to grow up and receive his education in a country marked by such dominating elements as a certain Calvinist mentality, resulting for me in a strong resistance against dogmatic theologies, a certain tradition of pragmatic tolerance of religious diversity, which I find very important, a focus on textual criticism and hermeneutic analysis, itself undoubtedly indebted again to many generations of Protestant Bible scholars, and a strongly developed sense of historical consciousness. That's to say, a kind of implicit awareness of being embedded in deep intellectual and scholarly traditions that can be traced back circa 2,500 years. It is essential to empirical methods, as I see it, that in order to discuss the properly philosophical dimensions of radical empiricism, which is the theme of this talk, I had to begin with the historical and even the very personal foundations of our current concept of esotericism. I'm arguing, as you will see, that everything we study should best be approached not top-down, by beginning with some theoretical perspective, but better bottom-up. by beginning with the historical and empirical perspectives that give rise to these theories and philosophies in the first place. So here we go. Historically, the very emergence of esotericism as a field of study is closely related to the parallel emergence of history of philosophy as a new academic discipline during the 17th and the 18th centuries. As I argued in my book, Esotericism in the Academy in 2012, these two fields, study of esotericism and history of philosophy, should be seen as one another's mirror images. They emerged together and they are in fact inseparable. Therefore, to speak about the study of esotericism as a field of study, I will first have to talk about the history of philosophy. Of central importance in this respect is the new 18th century phenomenon of eclectic historiography. Eclectic historiography. This was a new methodological principle that became dominant in this period. It stipulated that historians of philosophy should no longer bother to pay laborious attention to all these different philosophical sects from the past. They should not feel obliged to study everything that had existed. They should not bother to pay attention laboriously to each and every one of those ideas, including those that were now seen as mistaken or historical dead ends. Such a strictly empirical descriptive approach was dismissed under the title Philosophia Sectaria. On the contrary, so the argument went, historians of philosophy themselves should actively separate the wheat from the chaff by focusing only on those schools of thought that they, on the basis of their own rationally enlightened theoretical insights, that they saw as worth taking seriously, as truly rational and philosophically important. In other words, eclectic historiography deliberately privileged theory over empiricism. The pioneers of this historiographical eclecticism were these two guys that you see here, Jacob Thomasius and Christoph August Heumann, the founding editor of Acta Philosophorum, historically the very first academic journal devoted to history of philosophy. Based on their new eclectic historiography, then, Jacob Brucker produced a large multi-volume work known as Historia Critica Philosophiae, which covered the entire history of philosophy from the dawn of history to the present. Brucker became and remained the dominant, almost exclusive authority on all questions concerning history of philosophy until well into the 19th century. So the importance of Brucker can hardly be overestimated in my view. So why is this relevant to the study of esotericism? It is extremely relevant because Brucker's extremely influential work in fact consisted of a double narrative. One strand of his narrative traced the history of true philosophy from the beginnings to the present, while the other strand traced the parallel counter-history of false or pseudo-philosophy. If you look more closely at the contents of this second strand in Brucker's historical narrative, then you discover that it contained essentially all the author's traditions or types of intellectual speculation that would nowadays be categorized under the esotericism label. Brucker's own chief categories were Chaldean, Zoroastrian, Egyptian superstition, Neoplatonism, Kabbalah, and Theosophy. In other words, Brucker wrote the very first complete history of esotericism, although obviously from a very negative, dismissive perspective. His discussions were so detailed and so well informed, based on meticulous studies of primary and secondary sources, that later historians of philosophy no longer felt that they needed to do all that work all over again. Brucker had done it for them. They got the point, and the point was very simple. Brucker had demonstrated that all that weird stuff was just irrational, pseudo-philosophical nonsense that henceforth would no longer need to be treated as part of the history of philosophy at all. And so we see that all these ideas and traditions now vanished from standard histories of philosophy. They became academically homeless, and they were dropped from the academic curriculum. The point is that philosophy as such now defined or redefined its very identity as in a new and a very narrow manner, by sharply demarcating itself from what was now seen as mere pseudo-philosophy infected by magic, superstition, or the occult sciences. In short, Brucker constructed esotericism as philosophy's shadow. Now, this situation prevailed for about 2.5 centuries until the 1990s, starting with the work of Antoine Faivre, when all these traditions of rejected knowledge began to be moved back to the agenda of serious scholarship under the new label of esotericism. Therefore, the first point I need to make should be very clear. The modern study of esotericism is based on a principled rejection of the way in which academic philosophy and its history have been constructed, written, and taught from the 18th century to the very present. Studying esotericism as a serious field of research means rejecting the method of eclectic historiography. The alternative consists in an inclusive, anti-eclectic method that takes all historical traditions of philosophy seriously, regardless of whether they fit or violate contemporary historical canons and rational standards. It's obvious that such an anti-eclectic historiography must result in a serious blurring of all the traditional boundaries that have been drawn for reasons of theory between philosophy and religion or spirituality and many other fields. Ultimately, I will admit, it should even result in a complete erasure of any such boundary. The alternative that I advocate, therefore, consists in a radical historicization of so-called philosophy and its relation to so-called religion, so-called spirituality, or indeed so-called esotericism. All those terms refer ultimately to little more than artificial, often highly ideological and essentialist categories, rigid conceptual straitjackets, like boxes with sharp boundaries that simply cannot account for the fluidity and the extreme complexity that we actually find in the history of humanity and in human thought. So I want to dissolve all those boundaries. So there goes esotericism as an essentialist field. I mean, you get the point. So let me restate once again, because the point is often misunderstood. Just like philosophy itself, esotericism is an artificial category that should not be essentialized in any way. These are just pragmatic labels of convenience, useful to set certain traditions apart for special studies, at least temporarily. And if we tend to think of esotericism or philosophy as special fields, different from others, we are doing so only because of strictly historically contingent theories that we happen to have inherited. There is no reason why these theoretical categories should always remain the same. Now, to be perfectly honest, the modern study of esotericism, in my opinion, could be defined as a critical project that is concerned with undoing the serious intellectual damage, I mean this seriously, the damage that has been caused by a long history of academic neglect and distortion. A history in which, as I regret to tell the philosophers in the audience, philosophers and historians of philosophy have been key players. Undoing the damage means taking seriously again what used to be rejected, so as to bring it back to the table of academic research and reintegrate it completely into our normal standard histories and intellectual discussions. Now, I began this lecture by referring to my original concepts of empiricism and methodological agnosticism. Now, why is it that in my more recent work, I have come to insist so sharply on an even radical empiricism, grounded in a radical agnosticism? Now, first of all, I use the adjective radical according to its etymological meaning, referring to the word radix, root, hence the picture. When I use these terminologies, I have serious philosophical intentions. It's not just about a personal preference on my part for empirical bottom-up research of primary sources rather than top-down theory-driven approaches. Much more precisely than that, the philosophical claim that I'm making here is that everything is empirical. So please let that sink in. That is my basic statement today. Everything is empirical. When I say everything, I do not mean just tables and chairs or other observable realities such as animals or plants or planets. I mean literally anything, anything that appears or that may possibly appear to or in our field of consciousness as human beings. In other words, everything, the whole of reality, all of it is empirical. This includes not just the images in our minds, it also includes, crucially, our thoughts and our theories, as well as various intellectual procedures that we think of as rational, such as logic or mathematics. By stating that everything is empirical, I invite you to see logic and reason not as privileged a priori tools or instruments for the study of reality, as though they are somehow external to reality, and superior to it, abstract, that is literally drawn away from reality. On the contrary, I invite you to consider theories and rational or logical procedures as human a posteriori realities or aspects of reality, which ultimately have their place among all those other so-called objects of study that appear in our field of consciousness. Now, this is not a rejection of theory, as has been alleged sometimes, but it is a rejection of rationalist ideologies that privilege theory over empiricism in our attempts of understanding reality. Please note that although our common language forces me to speak about theories or logic as empirical objects of study, I am aware that this implies a misleading subject-object dualism. In this regard, I do embrace a core Kantian insight that it is our consciousness itself that constructs realities as appearing to us in time, space, and ruled by causal relations. So my claim is that ultimately all we really have is what we refer to as reality, whatever that may be. That is, all we have is the world of which we are conscious while we are alive, or of which we may potentially be conscious. A world that happens to include not just tables and chairs, but also such things as theories, rationalities, mathematics, or logic. The implication is that consciousness is neither something objective nor something subjective, but refers to the primary and irreducible fact that we are aware, that is, we are conscious of something to which we conventionally refer as reality. In a deliberate parallel to Parmenides' key insight that non-existence does not exist, that's one of the most famous, fascinating statements, I want to say, that I've ever encountered. Non-existence doesn't exist. In a deliberate parallel to that statement, I suggest that the non-conscious or the unconscious does not exist either. In other words, even states that we conventionally refer to as unconscious are actually just modifications of consciousness. That brings me to a further important point. My advocacy of radical empiricism is inseparable from my insistence that consciousness itself is not stable, but susceptible to alteration in a potentially limitless number of ways. We do not know how many. Alterations of consciousness and their effects have been reported throughout the whole of human history and are very important to the history of esotericism as well. They mean that one gains access to experiential dimensions that may be very different from our normal consensus reality, but that still remain integral parts of empirical reality. Moreover, such altered states of consciousness, including sleep and dreaming, trance, whatever, give rise to altered state of knowledge. And here I am indebted to the recently deceased American psychologist Charles T. Tart and his concept of state specificity. That is, unusual states of consciousness may enable us to know, to perceive, to learn about, or to become conscious of realities or dimensions of reality that are entirely inaccessible to us in our sober waking state. And of course, the converse is true as well. Our present state of sober wakefulness allows us to perceive, to learn, or to become conscious of realities or dimensions of reality that are entirely inaccessible to us in altered states. If all knowledge is state-specific, then the implication is that it's impossible to participate in all states of consciousness and thus in all states of knowledge at the same time. By entering one, we are always leaving another. Moreover, I'm aware of no convincing arguments for assuming the existence of some kind of meta level of consciousness that could function then as a superior vantage point for assessing or critically evaluating the knowledge or the claims of knowledge that are available to us in any of these different experiential states. If this is true, if this is convincing, then does this mean that we cannot distinguish between reality and hallucination, truth and illusion, rationality and madness? Well, yes. That is actually what it means, as Immanuel Kant already discovered. To his shock and to his deep concern, for all the details, you can, for instance, look at this very important study in German by Böhme and Böhme, but there are many other treatises. Now, of course, I know that certain states of consciousness are incompatible with the practical requirements of normal life in human societies. I know that psychotic states may be deeply frightening and harmful to individuals. Yet, and again, Kant came to the same conclusion, I see no convincing philosophical basis for the assumption that unusual conditions of consciousness should necessarily be less instructive about reality than the sane and the sober state in which, I assume, we currently find ourselves. If you find this doubtful, then please read, for instance, the brilliant Philosophy of Madness by the Dutch philosopher Wouter Hanegraaff. It's a fantastic read. Or have a look at Donald Hoffman's volume, The Case Against Reality. Be that as it may, the history of religion, and by way of esotericism, provides conclusive empirical proof that altered states of consciousness and their effects, including altered states of knowledge, are perfectly common phenomena that have occurred frequently to countless otherwise normal people in all cultures and all periods of history. They are parts of empirical reality, and that's the whole point I'm making here. Now, if we accept the absence of a meta level of consciousness, and if we accept the status of theories or logical procedures as empirical realities, among other empirical realities, then the implication is that perfect, conclusive, actually, I should have done on that. No, I'm sorry. I'm messing it up here. Okay. If we accept the absence of a meta level of consciousness and the status of theories or logical procedures as empirical realities, among other empirical realities, then the implication is that perfect, conclusive knowledge of reality as such is not possible. And it will never be possible. Now, in that empirical method article of mine in 1995, I defended methodological agnosticism by pointing out that if we are radically honest, we must admit that none of us has a clue about what is really going on around us, and especially how and for what reasons it is going on. To admit the grave inadequacies in our knowledge and our understanding of reality is more scientific than to fool ourselves about them. Now, 30 years of further study and reflection leave me even more convinced than ever that this is actually the case. But meanwhile, I have advanced from the simple principle of methodological agnosticism to a more complex philosophy of radical agnosticism. Methodological agnosticism acknowledges that there might be non-scientific and non-rational methods for gaining true knowledge. For instance, paranormal perceptions or gnosis or divine revelations and so on. But the position of radical agnosticism implies an additional point. It implies that we are not capable of ever knowing whether any claim of knowledge actually does amount to reliable and conclusive knowledge of what is really and ultimately the case. So let's imagine that tomorrow I have a deeply impressive mystical experience of radical non-duality or boundless noetic light. An experience that convinces me that the true nature of reality has now finally revealed itself to me. Even in such a case, I will still not actually know for certain what it really is that I have experienced, even though in my excitement I might be claiming otherwise. So I warn you, if I start doing this, don't believe me. So what appears to me as divine light could still be just a perceptual interface of something different, something whose true nature remains concealed from my understanding. I will readily admit that in drawing this conclusion, I have taken some inspiration from the Hermetic literature that I've been studying quite a lot. The Hermetic literature that is grounded in the deep conviction that an ultimate creative source of being, the pege in Greek, is present and active at the very heart of reality, while still professing utter agnosticism about what that source really is. And here's the quotation. Such a being that cannot be perceived by the senses is unlimited, incomprehensible, and immeasurable. It cannot be captured, nor grasped, nor hunted down. Where it is, whither it is going, whence it has come, or how it is, or what, all that is uncertain. In other words, even the extremely strong Hermetic claim of perfect salvational gnosis in which you see the light and you see reality, even that claim was still built on a radical agnosticism about its true object of knowledge. So the point about radical empiricism and radical agnosticism has been expressed in a wonderful sentence by Thomas Mann. I never lose an opportunity to quote Thomas Mann if I can, so I won't do that here either. In his great novel, Joseph and His Brothers, where we read, "A doubter I am, not because I believed in nothing, but because I consider anything possible." As you can see, radical agnosticism should not be understood as a negative position, but as a highly positive one. Now, it is on this basis that I build my claim that we cannot afford to exclude large parts of the history of human thought from serious consideration by dismissing them to a conceptual dustbin or wastebasket of rejected knowledge. We must reject the rejection of rejected knowledge by overturning that wastebasket, just in the way the kittens are doing in this nice picture. We have to overturn that wastebasket and examine what's in it, right? So we must recover all its contents and then integrate all of it back into the history of thought. I think I can guess what some of you may be thinking at this moment. Are you serious? What about all that nonsense? What about all those long discarded mistakes? Why should we study ideas that are irrational and false? Shouldn't philosophy be focused on what is rational and true? Well, my answer to this type of objection is that it's impossible for any understanding of philosophy, or history of philosophy, to focus just on what is true while dismissing what is false. It would be utterly counterproductive and in fact unphilosophical. All standard programs of philosophy accept the facts, whether they do it grudgingly or not, that there are many different theories or arguments that often contradict one another and cannot all be true. Philosophy, as I see it, consists in the search for knowledge and not in the claim of having found it. Well, precisely by listening and engaging in serious dialogue with those who approach this search for knowledge in ways that are entirely different from ours, we may gain insights. We may gain new understanding, including precious philosophical insights that otherwise would never have occurred to us. Never miss an opportunity to learn something new and have your opinions changed. And so, yes, that is really what I'm saying. Everybody who is searching for knowledge, including all those weird esoteric thinkers, deserve their place at the table of philosophical discussion. Again, of course, all of this implies a very serious blurring and dissolution of the artificial boundaries that have traditionally been drawn between philosophy, religion, spirituality, esotericism, psychology, or any other field that lays some claims to reliable knowledge about truth and reality. My intention is to question all the normative boundaries that we usually take for granted. This brings me to my final topic, counter-normativity and counter-normality. I recently rewrote my 2013 textbook on esotericism under the new title, Esotericism in Western Culture, Counter-Normativity and Rejected Knowledge. And so what do I mean by counter-normativity? So let me begin with a definition. Counter-normativity, as I understand it, is the project of demonstrating that what is commonly experienced as normal and gets presented to us as such, may in fact be the reflection of a hidden normative standard that should be critically examined and not just taken for granted. Now, such an agenda has actually inspired all my scholarly work from the very beginning, but only while rewriting this book did I come to define it in this specific manner with a new terminology. In doing so, I have collected many depths, for instance, to queer theory, to Jeff Kripal's work on the impossible, to Eric Davis' work on weirdness, Gisli Magnusson's work on Ervaringsmetaphysiek, metaphysics of experience, and there are others. A very important insight came from the philosopher Georges Canguilhem in his classic work on the normal and the pathological. The abnormal, as abnormal, comes after the definition of the normal. It is its logical negation, right? However, it is the historical anteriority of the future abnormal which gives rise to a normative intention. The normal is the effect obtained by the execution of the normative project. It is the norm exhibited by the fact. So the key point is that what we call normality is actually based on a normative standard that conceals its own presence. In other words, behind the appearance of normality, there's always a set of hidden normativities that should in fact be questioned critically instead of being taken for granted. The act of imposing a new norm, a new standard of normality, has the effect of discrediting and eventually erasing an anterior reality. It colonizes our conscious awareness. It banishes other conceptualizations from our view, suggesting that what is different must be wrong. As formulated by Walter Mignolo, the new normativity then becomes synonymous with the real by obstructing possible alternatives. And this leads to a key point. Under such conditions, the suppressed can only ever return to our conscious awareness in the form of what Eric Davis refers to as ontological weirdness. It is actually significant, I think, that scholars of esotericism among themselves so often refer to their topics when they talk with each other as the weird stuff, right? We are studying the weird stuff. That's what we're doing. Well, the weird or the uncanny, das Unheimliche in German, is precisely that which we find hardest to understand or even just to look at or to recognize because we struggle to find any place for it in our normative assumptions about truth and reality. By definition, the weird or the uncanny is the presence of something that should not be present, the impossible appearing in its very impossibility. In short, it is precisely that which is not normal. Because it doesn't fit our standards of normality, it threatens our most elementary assumptions about reality and truth, about how the world works. It may even cause us to question our own sanity. Therefore, we naturally defend ourselves against its presence by means of standard escape mechanisms, such as denying, forgetting, excluding, suppressing, ridiculing, or rationalizing. These psychological defenses all have the same basic function: to reassure us that everything is all right, that the world is reliable, that we are not crazy. Ontological weirdness is defined by the fact that it troubles our sense of normality along a wide spectrum for which I've coined the term counter-normality. So we end up with a pair of two complementary technical terms. Counter-normativity as a critical project questions the process of normalization itself, the imposition of a normative standard that ends up concealing its own presence, while counter-normality refers to the troubling effects of that process, the appearance of phenomena that in some sense are not normal. The weirdest and the most radically shocking forms of counter-normality are usually referred to as paranormal, literally beside or contrary to the normal. But along a sliding spectrum, we also encounter much more subtle forms of counter-normality as well. What I mean by this is that many qualitative phenomena and I find the notion qualitative phenomena important to emphasize, that many qualitative phenomena that occur in human experience or reality do not directly violate our core assumptions about what is real and true in a way that paranormal experiences are supposed to challenge them. They destabilize them, however, in a more mild and indirect manner. They do so by the simple fact that we do not know where to put them, where to give them a place. At some level, we are aware of having no place for such forms of subtle counternormality in our standard normative accounts of how the world works, or of what we are supposed to find important. Among the many, many examples that could be mentioned are, for instance, visions or voices. There are many people who hear voices. In terms of statistics, among the normal non-clinical population, it seems that about 10% of the general population hears voices. They're not crazy. They just hear voices. That's one example. Many people see visions, and they might not tell other people because people might think that they are crazy, but it's quite normal, actually. Visions or voices, altered states or experience of possession, lucid dreams or weird synchronicities, unitive experiences, intuitions or premonitions, a sense of invisible presences or inner guidance, including an experience of direct channeled inspiration, resulting sometimes in poetry or music, encounters with demons or angels or alien entities, experiences of bliss or ecstatic transport, for instance, while making love or running a marathon or listening to music, and so on and so forth and so forth. So there are many, many forms of counternormality. My point about subtle counternormality is that it inhabits a liminal place between the possible and the impossible. For although we know that they occur, our normative culture gives us the message that they are not really what they seem. Counternormality thus covers the entire spectrum between so-called paranormal events or experiences that violate our common sense beliefs about physical reality, and more subtle events or experiences such as hearing a voice in your head that gives you warnings or advice, for instance, Socrates' daimonion. So the spectrum runs from factual claims to contested interpretations. Skeptics will claim that the former are simply impossible, but about the latter they will object that certain explanations are impossible. Yet what they all have in common is that such things are not supposed to happen. They are not normal. Well, if I may borrow an expression from Donna Haraway, what defines the study of esotericism, or what should ideally define it, in my opinion, is a principled commitment to staying with the trouble of counternormality, both historically and philosophically. In other words, it means resisting our psychological defense mechanisms of outright denial, oblivion, exclusion, suppression, ridicule, or rationalization, simply not wanting to look there, not wanting to go there, not wanting to hear about it, and so on. The critical and intellectual reasons for this approach that I'm advocating are eminently philosophical, in the best Socratic tradition. They are based on a principled attitude of critical suspicion towards the operation of hidden normativities, especially the normative standards of rationality that conceal their own normativity by presenting themselves as perfectly normal. My final point is that such a project turns the core principles of the Enlightenment against the perverted understanding of enlightenment. Let's call them bad enlightenment against good enlightenment. Bad enlightenment, as I see it, is based on a dogmatic ideology of reason and science to the exclusion of everything else, tending ultimately toward the classic positivist doctrine that the exclusive source of reliable knowledge consists of nothing but normal sensory experience interpreted through reason and logic. This bad type of enlightenment defines its very identity in terms of the rejection of rejected knowledge. By sharp contrast, good enlightenment insists on respect for empirical evidence, no matter where it may lead, a rejection of ideological prejudice of any kind, unrestricted freedom of inquiry, openness to all perspectives and all possible outcomes, and confidence in the emancipatory power of critical discussion and argumentation. Therefore, it cannot accept the rejection of rejected knowledge, but it must insist on studying its materials carefully and critically, just like everything else. So that is what radical empiricism and radical agnosticism are all about in my book. The premise of philosophical inquiry is that we do not know. We do not know, but we would like to learn more if we can. To do so, I suggest that we need to study the full spectrum of experiential reality as it appears to us in human consciousness, empirically, without suppressing anything just because it happens to challenge our cherished theoretical convictions about what is real and true. On the contrary, precisely whatever troubles our beliefs is most worthy of investigation, because it might cause us to change our minds and learn something new. And on that note, I want to leave you with no one else than Socrates, my great hero, the foundational philosopher and ultimate agnostic, the man who truly knew that he did not know. In the Apology, he famously stated, "I am wiser than this man, for neither of us appears to know anything great and good, but he fancies that he knows something, although he knows nothing. Whereas I, as I do not know anything, do not fancy I do. In this trifling particular, then, I appear to be wiser than he, because I do not fancy I know what I do not know." He makes a small exception, though, in the Theagenes, where we read, "I know virtually nothing, except a certain small subject, love. On this subject, I am thought to be amazing, better than anyone else, past and present." I entirely agree. And so I leave you to ponder these words by the greatest philosopher of all time, a philosopher, by the way, who also happens to stand at the very origin of esotericism. But that would be another lecture. Thank you for your attention.